If you miss, we die. Commander Ethan Cross had delivered orders under enemy fire for nearly 14 years, but he had never heard fear in his own voice until that moment. The words escaped him across the burning canyon like something torn out of his chest, sharp and raw against the sound of rifle cracks echoing off the Afghan cliffs. Dust rolled through the valley in thick waves as another burst of gunfire snapped over the disabled convoy. One of the MRAPs burned 30 yards behind them, black smoke climbing into the evening sky while sparks drifted through the desert wind like dying fireflies. Ethan pressed himself against the fractured sandstone ridge and looked down at the blood soaking through his left glove. 2 of his men were already down. Another was pinned behind the shattered remains of a supply crate with ammunition running dangerously low. Above them, nearly 1,000 yards away along the northern ridge, dark figures moved between the rocks with terrifying discipline. Insurgents. Too many of them. Ethan counted at least 25 silhouettes shifting into firing positions while the fading sunlight vanished behind the mountains. They had the elevation. They had the angle. And in less than a minute, they would have a clean line straight into the trapped SEAL team below. "Commander, they're moving left," someone shouted through the radio static. Ethan looked up just long enough to see one of the hostile fighters carrying an RPG launcher toward the edge of the ridge. Another figure dropped prone beside a machine gun position already aimed directly into the canyon floor. Ethan's jaw tightened. Air support was still 12 minutes out. Their drone feed had vanished 20 minutes earlier after the communications jam began. Every escape route through the canyon was blocked by loose rock and incoming fire. They were surrounded in the worst possible terrain imaginable. Then he looked beside him. Claire Donovan lay flat behind the Barrett M82, completely motionless despite the chaos exploding around her. Dust gathered against her sleeves while the long barrel of the rifle rested steady over a broken slab of stone. She had arrived at the forward operating base less than 12 hours earlier with almost no introduction beyond a classified transfer order signed at the Pentagon level. Ethan remembered watching her step off the helicopter that morning carrying a weathered rifle case and a duffel bag with no unit markings. Some of the younger SEALs had exchanged confused looks the second they saw her. She was smaller than most snipers they had worked with, quiet to the point of being unreadable, with pale gray eyes that never seemed to settle anywhere for long. Nobody had expected her to be assigned to a combat Overwatch team. Not here. Not in the deadliest valley in the province. Another explosion thundered across the canyon wall, jerking Ethan back into reality. Small fragments of stone scattered across his shoulder as rounds slammed into the ridge above them. "Claire!" Ethan shouted. "You get one shot before they launch that RPG." She didn't answer immediately. Her breathing stayed calm. Slow. Measured. Through the scope, the insurgents were shifting rapidly between rocks nearly 900 yards away while crosswinds pushed sand across the canyon in violent bursts. Ethan had seen experienced snipers hesitate under conditions like this. Wind drift. Fading light. Elevation changes. Moving targets. It was the kind of shot that could end careers or lives in a single mistake. Then Claire finally spoke, her voice low and strangely steady compared to the panic surrounding them. "Not one shot." Ethan frowned. "What?" She reached up and adjusted the scope one precise click. "I'll need 10 seconds. Another burst of gunfire hammered the canyon floor. One of the younger SEALs cursed loudly over comms as debris sprayed across his cover position. Ethan felt his pulse slam against his ribs. 10 seconds. Against 25 targets spread across a mountain ridge. It sounded impossible. Insane, even. But Claire never looked away from the scope. Her finger rested lightly against the trigger guard while the desert wind whipped strands of loose blonde hair across her cheek. Around them, the battlefield seemed to narrow into fragments of sound. The hiss of burning metal. The crackle of distant radios. The sharp whistle of rounds cutting through air. Ethan realized something then that unsettled him more than the incoming fire. Claire Donovan wasn't nervous. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't even reacting to the danger around them. It was as if the battlefield had disappeared completely the moment she looked through that scope. Another insurgent stepped into position beside the RPG gunner. Ethan saw the launcher rise toward the trapped convoy below. "Claire," he said quietly this time, almost like a plea instead of an order. "Please." Her right eye narrowed behind the optic. The Barrett remained perfectly still despite the shifting winds crossing the canyon walls. Then Claire exhaled slowly, the way someone might before stepping into cold water, and whispered 4 words Ethan Cross would remember for the rest of his life. "Tell your men to breathe." The canyon fell strangely quiet after Claire Donovan whispered those 4 words. Not silent. Never silent. Gunfire still echoed somewhere above them, and the ruined convoy continued to crackle with heat and smoke beneath the fading orange sky. But inside the small defensive position where the SEAL team clung to survival, something shifted the moment Commander Ethan Cross repeated her instruction through the radio. "Everybody breathe," he ordered. His men obeyed instantly, though confusion lingered in their voices. Ethan stayed low beside Claire and watched her through the swirling dust. She had not moved more than an inch since settling behind the Barrett. Her left hand rested lightly beneath the stock while her right remained near the trigger with almost unnatural patience. Ethan had worked beside military snipers before. Some were calm under pressure. Others became sharper when chaos erupted around them. But Claire looked different. Detached. As if the canyon no longer existed. Another gust of desert wind tore through the ridge line, carrying sand across Ethan's face. The crosswind alone should have made accurate shots nearly impossible beyond 800 yards, especially with fading daylight swallowing the mountains one shadow at a time. Yet Claire never adjusted her posture. Her breathing stayed perfectly measured. Slow inhale. Slow exhale. Through the scope, the insurgents continued spreading across the upper ridge with disciplined movement. Ethan could barely make out individual silhouettes now. The enemy had chosen their position well. Elevated terrain. Layered cover. Narrow kill angles into the canyon below. Whoever coordinated the ambush knew exactly how to trap a convoy without escape routes. "Commander," one of the younger SEALs called through comms, his voice strained. "Movement east side. They are trying to flank." Ethan cursed under his breath and checked his sidearm instinctively even though he already knew ammunition was running low. Their options had collapsed nearly 20 minutes earlier when the first improvised explosive device disabled the lead vehicle. The second blast sealed the canyon behind them. Since then, everything had unraveled fast. No drone support. No satellite contact. No reinforcements close enough to matter. Just rock walls, smoke, and incoming fire from enemies they could barely see. Ethan glanced back at Claire again. 12 hours earlier, he had almost argued against bringing her onto the operation. He remembered standing inside the operations tent that morning while his executive officer handed him the updated roster. "Sniper replacement?" Ethan had asked. "That was supposed to be Walker." His executive officer shrugged. Orders came from higher up. Then Claire Donovan walked into the briefing room carrying a weathered rifle case that looked older than some of the men in the unit. No introductions. No attempt at conversation. She sat through the mission briefing without asking a single question while the younger operators exchanged skeptical glances behind her back. Ethan remembered one of them quietly muttering, "She looks like a college professor, not a combat sniper." Another joked about the transfer being political. Claire had ignored every comment. She simply opened a notebook, copied down grid coordinates, and closed it again without expression. Looking back now, Ethan realized she had probably heard every word. Another sharp burst of incoming rounds snapped across the canyon wall above them. Loose rock scattered down the ridge as one of the SEALs ducked lower behind cover. "We cannot stay here," someone shouted. Ethan looked uphill again and saw the RPG operator stepping closer to the edge of the ridge line. The launcher angled downward toward the stranded convoy vehicles below. Time was disappearing. "Claire," Ethan said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "How many can you actually see?" Her answer came instantly. 25. Ethan blinked. Through binoculars he could barely track half that number in the fading light. "You counted all of them?" "No," she replied calmly. "I memorized their spacing." Ethan stared at her for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then Claire shifted slightly behind the rifle for the first time. Just enough to settle the stock deeper into her shoulder. Her eyes never left the optic. "Wind changed 3 degrees west," she murmured softly. "Visibility dropping fast." Ethan followed her line of sight but still could not understand how she remained so composed while the entire canyon threatened to collapse around them. Another operator crawled beside Ethan, breathing heavily from exertion. "Commander, who is this woman?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. The truth was he did not know. Her personnel file had arrived heavily redacted. Most of her operational history was classified above his clearance level. Even her previous unit assignment had been blacked out. All Ethan knew was that someone at the Pentagon wanted Claire Donovan attached to this mission badly enough to override normal command procedures. At the time, he thought it was bureaucracy. Now he was no longer certain. Claire adjusted the elevation dial one final time. Then she spoke without emotion, her voice almost lost beneath the distant echo of gunfire. "The RPG operator goes first. After that, they will panic." Ethan looked toward the ridge again and saw movement increasing among the hostile positions. The enemy fighters were preparing to descend into the canyon. Once they started moving downhill, the trapped SEAL team would lose what little cover remained. "Claire," Ethan said carefully, "you are talking about 25 targets spread across nearly a quarter mile." Her fingers settled gently against the trigger. "Then I should not waste time." The canyon wind shifted again, colder this time, carrying dust through the fading evening light as Claire Donovan settled fully behind the Barrett M82. Commander Ethan Cross watched her carefully, unable to pull his eyes away from the strange calm surrounding her while the battlefield continued collapsing around them. Another burst of incoming fire cracked against the rocks 50 feet to their right, forcing 2 SEALs lower behind cover. One of the convoy trucks groaned as flames crawled higher along the damaged frame, throwing flickering orange light across the canyon walls. Above them, 25 hostile fighters moved between jagged rocks along the ridge line, preparing to descend into the kill zone below. Ethan checked his watch instinctively. 8 minutes until air support. Maybe less if the pilots pushed beyond protocol. But deep down, he already knew 8 minutes was an eternity they did not have. "Commander," a voice called through the headset. "Thermal movement west side. They are repositioning." Ethan looked uphill again and saw silhouettes spreading wider across the ridge. The insurgents were adapting quickly. They knew the convoy was trapped. They knew darkness was coming. Soon the canyon floor would become impossible to defend. Claire slowly rolled her shoulders once, loosening tension with controlled precision. The movement looked almost mechanical. Practiced. Ethan noticed something then that made his stomach tighten. Her breathing had slowed even further. 4 seconds in. 4 seconds out. Like someone lowering their heartbeat intentionally. "How long have you been doing this?" Ethan asked quietly without taking his eyes off the ridge. Claire remained focused through the scope. "Long enough." It was not an answer. Before Ethan could press further, another operator crawled beside them carrying a half-empty magazine pouch. Petty Officer Logan Reed was one of the youngest men on the team, barely 24 years old with less than 2 combat deployments behind him. Sweat streaked through the dust on his face as he glanced nervously between Claire and the ridge above. "Commander," Logan whispered carefully, "are we seriously trusting one sniper against all of them?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He was asking himself the same question. Claire finally spoke without lifting her eye from the optic. You are not trusting one sniper. Logan frowned. What does that mean? Claire adjusted her grip slightly beneath the rifle stock. It means they made a mistake before they ever fired the first shot. Ethan stared at her again. There was no arrogance in her voice. No attempt to sound intimidating. She spoke the way someone might discuss weather patterns or road directions. Calm. Certain. Detached from emotion completely. Then Ethan remembered something from earlier that morning. During final equipment inspection before the convoy rolled out, one of the SEAL operators had jokingly challenged Claire to test fire her rifle on the range. You ever shoot one of these under real pressure? The operator had asked while nodding toward the Barrett. Claire had paused only long enough to chamber a round before hitting 3 steel targets almost faster than the others could register the sound. 900 yards. 1200. 1400. Every impact landed center mass despite heavy morning winds sweeping across the valley. Nobody laughed after that. But nobody spoke much to her either. Ethan realized now that the silence around Claire Donovan had never been discomfort. It had been distance. As if she operated somewhere mentally unreachable from everyone else around her. Commander, Logan said suddenly, his voice tense again. RPG moving. Ethan snapped back toward the ridge. The insurgent carrying the launcher had stepped onto a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon floor. Beside him, 2 others shifted into support positions while additional fighters spread along the rocks preparing to push downhill. Ethan felt the weight of the entire battlefield narrowing into one impossible moment. If that launcher fired into the trapped convoy, the canyon would become a graveyard within seconds. Claire's finger moved lightly against the trigger. Still no shot. Ethan looked at her sharply. Claire. Wait. Her voice stayed level. Wind is fighting the canyon walls. Ethan clenched his jaw. Every second felt unbearable now. More enemy movement appeared across the ridge while fading sunlight swallowed detail from the mountains. Another SEAL operator muttered a quiet prayer beneath his breath somewhere behind them. Logan tightened his grip on his rifle hard enough for his knuckles to pale beneath the dust. Claire remained perfectly still. Then suddenly, she lifted her head slightly from the scope for the first time since taking position. Her gray eyes scanned the canyon walls, studying drifting sand particles caught in the crosswind. Ethan noticed her pupils narrow slightly as she tracked the movement of dust through the air. Not fear. Calculation. There, she whispered. What? Ethan asked. Claire settled back behind the optic. The canyon just stabilized. Ethan had no idea what that meant, but her posture changed instantly afterward. The hesitation disappeared. Every movement became sharper. Faster. Deliberate. Through the scope, Claire watched the ridge line like a predator studying motion before a strike. The RPG operator stepped fully into view. Another fighter crouched beside a mounted machine gun. 3 more emerged behind them carrying ammunition crates toward the edge of the cliff. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. Claire, he said quietly, you only have one chance at this. She exhaled once. Slow. Controlled. No, Commander, she replied softly. They only have one chance. Then the Barrett thundered across the canyon. The first shot rolled across the canyon like distant thunder, deep and heavy enough to shake loose dust from the cliffs above the convoy. Commander Ethan Cross watched through his binoculars as the insurgent carrying the RPG suddenly disappeared backward behind the ridge line. For half a second, the entire battlefield froze. Then chaos erupted above them. Fighters scattered between rocks while voices echoed through the mountains in sharp bursts of confusion. Claire Donovan did not pause to admire the result. The instant recoil settled, she chambered another round with smooth mechanical precision. Ethan barely had time to inhale before the Barrett thundered again. A second silhouette near the mounted machine gun dropped out of sight behind the rocks. Holy hell, Logan Reed whispered beside Ethan. Claire remained completely motionless except for the controlled rhythm of her breathing and the steady movements of her hands. The canyon wind pushed dust across her sleeves, but the rifle barrel never drifted more than an inch. Ethan looked back toward the ridge and realized something terrifying. The insurgents no longer understood where the shots were coming from. They were trained fighters. Coordinated. Disciplined. But the speed of Claire's fire shattered their rhythm almost instantly. One moment they had complete control over the canyon. The next, every exposed movement became dangerous. Another shot echoed through the valley. Then another. Ethan struggled to track the impacts through the fading light. Claire was already adjusting targets before the previous shot fully finished echoing against the mountains. She is reading movement patterns, Ethan muttered under his breath. Logan stared at him. What? Ethan lowered the binoculars slightly, disbelief spreading across his face. She is not shooting people. She is shooting positions before they commit to movement. Logan looked back toward Claire with stunned confusion. How is that even possible? Ethan did not answer because he no longer knew. The fourth shot cracked through the canyon air. One of the hostile fighters attempting to relocate ammunition crates vanished behind the rocks before reaching cover. Another silhouette tried to sprint across an open section of ridge line. Claire fired again almost instantly. Dust exploded across the cliff edge, forcing the remaining insurgents lower behind the ridge. Suddenly the pressure on the canyon floor began easing. Incoming rounds became scattered instead of coordinated. The machine gun position fell silent. Ethan heard one of his operators shouting through comms that the western flank had stopped advancing. "Commander," another SEAL called out, shock filling his voice, "they are backing off." Ethan looked uphill again and realized the enemy fighters were no longer descending toward the convoy. They were retreating deeper into cover. Not because reinforcements had arrived. Not because air support appeared overhead. Because one sniper hidden inside the canyon had completely broken their momentum in less than 10 seconds. Claire worked the bolt again with calm efficiency. Her eyes stayed fixed through the optic, scanning the ridge line for movement Ethan could not even see. 3 left side, she murmured quietly. Then the Barrett roared again. Ethan flinched instinctively despite himself. He had seen elite marksmen before. But this felt different. Faster. Colder. There was no wasted motion anywhere in Claire's body. No hesitation between targets. Every adjustment looked automatic, almost disconnected from conscious thought. The younger operators nearby stared at her openly now. Nobody spoke. Nobody questioned her anymore. They simply listened to the rhythm of the rifle and watched the canyon slowly shift in their favor. Another insurgent briefly appeared behind a jagged rock formation nearly 1,400 yards away. Ethan only caught a glimpse before Claire fired once more. Silence followed. Logan slowly lowered his weapon. How many was that? Ethan checked the ridge carefully through binoculars. He could no longer see organized movement anywhere along the canyon walls. Smoke drifted through fading sunlight while shadows swallowed the remaining ridges. I do not know, Ethan admitted quietly. Enough. Claire finally lifted her head from the scope for the first time since firing. Her expression had not changed at all. No excitement. No adrenaline. Just quiet focus while she scanned the mountains one last time. Wait, she said softly. Ethan looked toward her immediately. What is it? Claire narrowed her eyes toward the eastern ridge. Spotter. Ethan froze. A second later, he noticed movement nearly 1,500 yards away near a narrow rock shelf. Someone hidden deep in overwatch position. Watching the canyon through optics. Coordinating the ambush from a distance. Ethan's stomach tightened. Whoever that spotter was, he had stayed concealed through the entire exchange while the others lost control around him. Claire adjusted her elevation slightly. Her breathing slowed again. "That is the one who planned this," she whispered. Ethan studied the distant ridge through binoculars, barely able to make out the figure against the darkening rocks. "You can hit that from here." Claire never looked away from the optic. "He thinks the shadows are protecting him." The canyon fell quiet once more. Smoke drifted upward from the convoy wreckage while wind curled through the rocks in long low whistles. Somewhere behind them, one of the SEAL operators quietly said, "Who is she?" Nobody answered. Claire exhaled slowly. Then the Barrett thundered across the mountains one final time. The final shot echoed across the canyon walls and disappeared into the mountains beyond the ridge. Then everything stopped. Commander Ethan Cross kept the binoculars pressed against his eyes, staring toward the eastern overlook where the hidden spotter had been positioned moments earlier. Nothing moved now. No shifting shadows. No radio flashes. No organized movement anywhere along the cliffs. Only drifting smoke and fading sunlight settling across the desert valley. Ethan slowly lowered the binoculars, struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Around him, the surviving SEAL operators remained frozen behind cover, their rifles still raised even though the canyon had fallen nearly silent for the first time in over an hour. Logan Reed looked uphill cautiously, disbelief written across his exhausted face. "It is over?" he asked quietly. Ethan listened carefully. No coordinated gunfire answered him. No advancing footsteps echoed through the rocks. The hostile fighters who had controlled the canyon minutes earlier were gone. Some had retreated deeper into the mountains while others simply vanished from their positions entirely after Claire shattered the ambush from inside the kill zone itself. Ethan exhaled slowly and keyed his radio. "All teams report status." Voices answered one by one through the static. "Tired. Shaken. But alive." One injured operator near the rear convoy vehicle confirmed that incoming fire had stopped completely. Another team farther west reported movement withdrawing from the upper ridges. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. They had survived. Barely. He turned toward Claire Donovan, expecting at least some trace of emotion after what she had just done. Relief. Adrenaline. Fatigue. Instead, she calmly opened the Barrett's action and began inspecting the chamber with the same detached focus she had shown before the first shot. Her breathing had already returned to normal. "Claire," Ethan said carefully. "How did you know about the spotter?" She wiped a trace of dust from the rifle scope with her glove before answering. The attack pattern was too clean. Ethan frowned slightly. "Meaning?" Claire looked toward the darkening ridges. "Most fighters react emotionally once a plan starts failing. Someone on that mountain kept redirecting them even after the first shots landed." Logan stared at her. "You figured that out during combat?" Claire finally looked at him directly for the first time. "You can learn a lot from panic." Logan said nothing after that. The younger operator simply leaned back against the rocks, still trying to reconcile the quiet woman beside them with the impossible sequence of shots he had just witnessed. Ethan reached for his radio again when another voice suddenly broke through the static. "Viking Actual, this is Falcon Air Support. We are entering the valley now. Repeat, air support entering the valley." Ethan looked upward instinctively as the distant roar of approaching aircraft rolled faintly across the mountains. Too late to save them. But not too late to confirm the canyon was finally secure. "Falcon, this is Viking Actual," Ethan replied. "Hostile activity suppressed. Proceed with overwatch." A pause followed before the pilot answered again. "Copy that, Viking. We are reading unusual heat signatures all across the northern ridge. What happened down there?" Ethan glanced toward Claire. She had already finished inspecting the rifle and was quietly repacking equipment beside the rocks as if the last 10 minutes had been routine. Ethan keyed the radio again slowly. "We had help." He released the transmission button and looked back toward the canyon walls. Darkness was spreading quickly now, swallowing detail from the cliffs while cold desert air swept through the valley floor. Medical personnel moved carefully between damaged vehicles, checking the wounded while operators began gathering ammunition and equipment from defensive positions. The battlefield no longer felt chaotic. Just exhausted. Ethan sat down heavily against the rocks beside Claire, finally allowing tension to leave his shoulders. For the first time all evening, his hands were shaking slightly. Claire noticed immediately. "Adrenaline crash," she said quietly. Ethan let out a short humorless laugh. "That obvious? Only to people who have had one before." Ethan studied her profile in silence for a moment. Her face remained calm beneath streaks of dust and fading light, but now that the immediate danger had passed, he noticed something else. Fatigue. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. Older. The kind of tiredness that settles behind someone's eyes after too many years spent surviving impossible situations. "Who trained you?" Ethan asked finally. Claire paused while securing another magazine inside the rifle case. "Different people." "That is not an answer." She zipped the case shut without looking at him. "It is the only one you are getting tonight." Ethan almost pressed further when Logan suddenly approached carrying a small thermal scanner recovered from one of the damaged vehicles. "Commander," he said carefully, "you need to see this." Ethan took the scanner and looked toward the ridge line where the ambush had begun. The thermal overlay displayed scattered heat traces retreating deeper into the mountains. But one section of the ridge caught his attention immediately. Nearly every hostile position Claire engaged had been neutralized in a pattern that looked disturbingly precise. Not random suppression. Not desperate survival fire. It resembled controlled dismantling of an entire battlefield. Logan swallowed hard. "Commander," she took apart their command structure first. Ethan slowly lowered the scanner and looked back toward Claire Donovan. She stood near the edge of the canyon now with the Barrett case resting beside her boots while cold wind moved through her blonde hair. Alone against the darkening mountains. Quiet again. Like the storm had never happened at all. The helicopters arrived 3 minutes later, their rotor wash tearing through the canyon and sending clouds of dust spiraling across the damaged convoy. Commander Ethan Cross stepped away from the ridge as medics moved toward the wounded operators while the remaining SEALs secured the perimeter. The immediate danger had passed, but nobody inside the canyon looked relaxed. Too much had happened too quickly. Too many men had come within seconds of never leaving the valley alive. Ethan watched Claire Donovan standing near the edge of the rocks with the Barrett case resting beside her boots. She remained separate from the others even now. No celebration. No relief. Just silence while cold desert wind swept through the canyon. Logan Reed approached Ethan carefully, still holding the recovered thermal scanner in one hand. "Commander," he said quietly, "the pilots are asking who neutralized the ridge." Ethan kept his eyes on Claire. "Tell them it was our sniper." Logan hesitated. "That answer is not going to satisfy anyone." Ethan almost smiled at that because he understood exactly what Logan meant. Nothing about tonight made sense. Not the speed. Not the precision. Not the way Claire dismantled an organized ambush faster than most teams could react to one. The helicopter crews had already started scanning the upper ridges with thermal optics, and every report coming back sounded more confused than the last. One pilot described the ridge line as looking surgically collapsed. Another asked whether artillery support had been deployed without authorization. Ethan knew the truth sounded even less believable. One sniper. 10 seconds. 25 hostile positions broken apart before the enemy even understood what was happening. Commander Cross. Ethan turned as one of the Air Force pilots climbed down from the helicopter and approached the defensive position. Captain Daniel Mercer was a veteran extraction pilot with nearly 2 decades in combat zones, the kind of man who rarely looked impressed by anything anymore. But tonight his expression carried genuine disbelief. "Your people said the enemy force was suppressed from inside the canyon," Mercer said carefully. That accurate? Ethan nodded once. Mercer looked toward the ridge line and shook his head slowly. I flew over those positions 30 seconds ago. Whoever did that controlled the entire battlefield from one angle. Ethan said nothing. Mercer followed his gaze toward Claire. That her? Claire did not look back at them. She simply tightened the straps on her rifle case and stared toward the darkening mountains. Mercer lowered his voice slightly. Who exactly did they send you? Ethan let out a tired breath. I am starting to wonder the same thing. Nearby, medics helped one injured operator toward the evacuation helicopter while another team gathered damaged equipment from the convoy. The canyon no longer sounded like a battlefield. It sounded exhausted. Metal creaked softly from the ruined vehicles. Rotor blades echoed against the cliffs. Boots scraped across loose stone while men moved slower now that survival was no longer the only thing keeping them upright. Logan suddenly approached again, carrying a folded tablet recovered from one of the convoy communication cases. Commander, he said quietly, you should see this. Ethan took the tablet and frowned. The screen displayed a partially restored mission file pulled from emergency encrypted backups. Most of the data remained corrupted after the communications blackout, but one section had recovered successfully. Personnel transfers. Ethan's eyes narrowed immediately when he saw Claire Donovan's name. Nearly every line beneath it was classified. Unit history redacted. Operational assignments sealed. Even deployment records were blacked out beneath military clearance warnings. But one line near the bottom remained partially visible. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. Ghost Valkyrie Initiative, he read quietly. Logan shifted uneasily. You ever heard of that? Ethan shook his head slowly. No, Captain Mercer leaned closer. Sounds like special operations. Ethan kept reading. Another fragment of text appeared beneath the classified markers. Instructor designation approved. Advanced Long-Range Warfare Program. Combat Survival Rating, exceptional. Ethan looked back toward Claire again. The cold wind lifted strands of blonde hair across her face while she remained completely still near the ridge. There was something unsettling about her calm now that the adrenaline had faded from the canyon. Not arrogance. Not emotional distance. Something heavier. Like someone carrying years of silence nobody else could understand. Commander, Logan said carefully, there is more. Ethan scrolled lower through the damaged file until another partially recovered line appeared. Kandahar Incident. Status, Survivor. Every operator near Ethan went quiet. Even Captain Mercer stopped speaking. In military circles, Kandahar carried weight. Too many stories. Too many classified operations whispered about but never fully discussed. Ethan looked up slowly. What incident? Logan swallowed hard. The file is damaged. But whatever happened there, he hesitated before finishing quietly. Almost nobody came back. Ethan looked toward Claire once more, and suddenly the exhaustion behind her eyes made sense. Not completely. But enough to understand why someone like her moved through combat with such detached precision. She was not reacting to chaos the way normal soldiers did. She had already survived worse. Claire finally turned toward them after several seconds, her gray eyes settling briefly on the tablet in Ethan's hands. She recognized the expression on their faces immediately. You should stop reading damaged files, she said calmly. Ethan stepped closer. Claire, she lifted the rifle case before he could continue. The canyon is secure. Your men are alive. That is what matters. Ethan frowned. And the rest? Claire looked past him toward the dark mountains beyond the ridge line. The rest is why they stopped putting my name in reports years ago. Then she walked toward the helicopter while the entire canyon remained silent behind her. The helicopter lifted out of the canyon under a sky turning dark blue above the mountains, its rotors cutting through cold desert air while Commander Ethan Cross sat across from Claire Donovan in complete silence. Around them, exhausted SEAL operators leaned against the interior walls with dirt-covered uniforms and tired eyes fixed on the metal floor beneath their boots. Nobody inside the aircraft spoke much anymore. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by the heavy quiet that always followed survival. Ethan glanced toward Claire again. She sat near the rear loading ramp with her Barrett case secured beside her knee, her posture steady despite the turbulence shaking through the helicopter frame. Most soldiers looked different after combat. Hands trembling. Shoulders tense. Eyes restless from replaying every second in their minds. Claire looked exactly the same as she had before the canyon erupted. Calm. Controlled. Distant. Logan Reed finally broke the silence first. You knew they buried your records. Claire kept her eyes on the darkness outside the aircraft. Most records get buried eventually. Logan frowned. Not like yours. Ethan noticed several operators quietly listening now even though nobody interrupted. The surviving SEALs had spent the last 20 minutes piecing together fragments from damaged files, overheard pilot chatter, and classified transfer notes that should never have existed in the same place together. Every trail led back to the same conclusion. Claire Donovan was not a replacement sniper accidentally assigned to their mission. She had been sent there deliberately. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What happened in Kandahar? The helicopter vibrated softly beneath them while Claire remained silent for several seconds. Ethan almost thought she would ignore the question entirely. Then she finally spoke. A convoy disappeared in the mountains near the Pakistan border 12 years ago. Her voice stayed flat. Emotionless. Officially, sandstorms interrupted communication and rescue teams arrived too late. Logan looked confused. Officially? Claire nodded once. Unofficially, somebody sold our position before we crossed the valley. The aircraft grew even quieter. Ethan watched her carefully now. How many operators? Claire stared into the darkness outside the helicopter. 32. Logan swallowed hard. And you survived? Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and tightened one strap on the Barrett case beside her boots as if the movement helped anchor her thoughts somewhere far away from the helicopter. I was the Overwatch sniper, she said finally. I watched the ambush happen from nearly 2,000 yards away. Ethan felt a chill move through him despite the warm air inside the aircraft. 2,000 yards. Even by elite military standards, that distance was almost impossible terrain for effective battlefield response. You could not reach them in time, Ethan said quietly. Claire's eyes shifted toward him for the first time since leaving the canyon. I reached some of them. Nobody spoke after that. The meaning behind her words settled heavily across the aircraft cabin. Ethan suddenly understood why the Pentagon buried parts of her history. Why her combat file carried sealed classifications. Why she moved through battle like someone who had already seen every possible version of disaster unfold before her eyes. Logan looked down at his hands. That is why they called it the Ghost Valkyrie program. Claire gave a faint nod. After Kandahar, they rebuilt the sniper division around survival psychology and long-range battlefield disruption. Ethan frowned. Meaning? Claire looked toward the cockpit windows where distant moonlight reflected softly against the glass. They stopped training snipers to eliminate targets. She paused briefly. They trained us to collapse entire engagements before they fully started. Logan stared at her in disbelief. That is what you did in the canyon. Claire said nothing, but Ethan could see the answer in her expression. Every shot inside the canyon had not simply removed threats. She had dismantled command flow, movement coordination, and battlefield confidence faster than the enemy could adapt. She had turned organized attackers into scattered survivors within seconds. One of the older SEAL operators sitting near the side hatch suddenly spoke for the first time all flight. Chief Mason Burke had spent nearly 20 years in special operations and rarely looked impressed by anyone. But now even he studied Claire carefully. "I heard stories about Kandahar," Burke said quietly. "People said one sniper held the northern ridge alone long enough for survivors to escape the valley." Claire's expression hardened almost invisibly. "Stories get exaggerated." Burke shook his head slowly. "Not the ones I heard." Ethan noticed Claire's left hand tighten slightly against the rifle case for just a moment before relaxing again. It was the first crack in her calm anyone had seen all night. Not fear. Memory. Pain buried so deeply it surfaced only in small uncontrollable movements. The helicopter suddenly banked left as the forward operating base appeared ahead through the darkness, runway lights glowing faintly against the desert floor. Ethan looked out the side hatch toward the base perimeter and realized something uncomfortable. Every operator inside this aircraft respected Claire now. Completely. But none of them actually knew how to speak to someone like her anymore. Because legend sounded exciting in briefings and combat stories. In real life, legends usually looked tired. Alone. And older than their years. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Logan leaned closer toward Ethan and whispered carefully, "Commander. Do you think she ever stops thinking about that valley?" Ethan looked toward Claire Donovan sitting silently beside the Barrett case while moonlight reflected softly across her pale face. Then he answered without taking his eyes off her. "No," he said quietly. "I think she learned how to survive with it." The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base just after midnight, its landing lights cutting across the dusty runway while ground crews rushed toward the returning convoy team. Commander Ethan Cross stepped onto the tarmac with stiff legs and exhaustion buried deep in his shoulders. Around him, surviving SEAL operators moved slowly beneath the floodlights while medics guided the injured toward the base hospital. The desert night air felt colder than usual, carrying the smell of fuel, dust, and overheated machinery across the compound. Ethan turned instinctively toward Claire Donovan, expecting her to follow the team toward debriefing. Instead, she lifted the Barrett case from the helicopter floor and quietly walked toward the far end of the runway alone. No one stopped her. Logan Reed noticed it too. "Where is she going?" Ethan watched Claire disappear past the maintenance hangars toward a dark section of the base perimeter. "Probably somewhere quiet." Logan hesitated before speaking again. "Commander. I do not think she likes being around people after missions." Ethan remembered the look in Claire's eyes when Kandahar was mentioned during the flight back. Not fear. Not guilt. Something far heavier. Like a person carrying memories too sharp to ever fully set down. "Get the team through medical evaluations," Ethan ordered quietly. "I will handle the debrief." Logan nodded and headed toward the operations building while Ethan stood alone beneath the runway lights for another moment. Then he looked toward the far edge of the base where Claire had disappeared into darkness and made a decision he did not fully understand himself. 10 minutes later, Ethan found her sitting behind the abandoned maintenance shed near the old perimeter fence. The base noise sounded distant there. Helicopters hummed somewhere across the compound while generators buzzed softly beyond the wire. Claire sat on an overturned equipment crate with the Barrett resting across her knees, methodically cleaning desert dust from the rifle as if the battlefield still existed around her. Ethan approached carefully. Most people head to medical after nearly dying. Claire did not look up. Most people are smarter than me. Ethan leaned against the fence nearby. That canyon should not have ended the way it did. Claire slid a cleaning cloth slowly along the rifle barrel. It almost did. Ethan studied her quietly for several seconds. Under the pale security lights, she looked older than she had earlier that day. Not physically older. Just worn down in ways combat left behind after enough years. "The men are talking about you already," Ethan said finally. Claire gave the faintest shake of her head. "They are talking about tonight." "That fades." Not this time. She finally looked up at him then. Her gray eyes looked colder under the floodlights, but Ethan noticed something else hidden beneath them now. Fatigue so deep it almost looked painful. "Commander," she said quietly, "you know what happens when soldiers start believing stories about people like me?" Ethan crossed his arms. "Respect?" Claire looked away again. "Distance." The answer caught him off guard. She continued cleaning the Barrett in silence for a few moments before speaking again. "At first they admire you. Then they stop talking normally around you. Eventually you become something useful instead of someone human." Ethan frowned slightly. "That has happened before." Claire let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a tired laugh. "More than once." Wind moved through the perimeter fencing while distant voices echoed faintly across the base. Ethan noticed Claire's hands pause briefly against the rifle stock. Tiny tremors. Barely visible. But enough for him to notice. "Your hands are shaking," he said quietly. Claire immediately resumed cleaning the rifle. "Cold weather." Ethan did not believe her. Neither did she. "Kandahar still follows you." This time Claire became completely still. For several long seconds, the only sound came from helicopters lifting somewhere beyond the runway. Finally she spoke without looking at him. "There were 6 operators trapped on the North Ridge after the convoy collapsed." Ethan listened carefully, saying nothing. "I could hear them through the radio while the valley closed around them." Her voice remained calm, but the tremor in her hands returned slightly stronger now. One by one, the transmissions stopped. Ethan felt the weight behind every word. Claire swallowed once before continuing. "The last operator alive asked me how much ammunition I had left." She stared at the rifle across her knees. "I told him enough." Ethan slowly lowered himself onto a nearby crate beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The desert wind curled softly around the maintenance yard while floodlights painted long shadows across the concrete. Claire finally looked toward the mountains beyond the perimeter fence. "That is the worst part about surviving," she said quietly. "People think survival means you won." Ethan stared at her in silence. "But some parts of you never leave the valley." Claire nodded once. "Exactly." Somewhere across the base, alarms suddenly sounded near the operations center followed by hurried radio chatter echoing through the night. Ethan reached instinctively for his comms device, but before he could activate it, a young communications officer sprinted around the maintenance building looking breathless. "Commander Cross." Ethan stood immediately. "What happened?" The officer looked between Ethan and Claire with visible tension. "Sir. Central Command just transmitted a priority alert." Ethan's expression hardened. "About what?" The officer swallowed hard before answering. "The insurgent commander from tonight's ambush survived the canyon." Claire slowly closed the Barrett case beside her. Then, for the first time all night, her eyes lost every trace of exhaustion and became something far more dangerous. The operations center erupted into motion less than 5 minutes later. Large tactical screens glowed across the darkened room while intelligence officers moved between stations carrying updated satellite reports and intercepted transmissions from the mountains north of the valley. Commander Ethan Cross stood near the center table beside Claire Donovan as the atmosphere inside the base shifted from exhausted relief back into quiet urgency. Colonel Marcus Hale, the ranking officer overseeing regional operations, looked up from a classified briefing tablet as Ethan entered. "Cross," he said sharply, "your canyon ambush was not random." Ethan frowned. "Explain." Hale tapped the screen once and several satellite images appeared across the operations wall. The same canyon. The same northern ridge line. But now highlighted with layered movement routes extending deeper into the mountains. "The insurgent commander coordinating tonight's attack is named Farid Rahman," Hale said. "Former military strategist. Trained fighters across 3 provinces before disappearing 6 years ago. Ethan crossed his arms. And tonight? Hale looked toward Claire briefly before continuing. Tonight was supposed to be his largest coordinated operation in nearly a decade. Silence settled across the room. Ethan studied the maps carefully. He survived the canyon. Hale nodded once. Barely. Our surveillance drone tracked a single heat signature escaping east through the mountain pass 40 minutes ago. Ethan looked toward Claire instinctively. She remained perfectly still beside the operations table, her expression unreadable beneath the cold glow of the tactical screens. What is his objective now? Ethan asked. Hale hesitated before answering. Intelligence believes he is heading toward a civilian supply route running near the border villages. Several officers in the room exchanged tense looks immediately. Those villages housed contractors, medical teams, and local families caught between military operations and insurgent territory. Ethan already understood the danger before Hale finished speaking. If Rahman reaches the villages, Hale said quietly, he rebuilds support networks and disappears again. Ethan looked toward Claire. Can we intercept him? Before Hale answered, Claire finally spoke. Yes. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. Colonel Hale narrowed his gaze slightly. The drone lost visual confirmation 30 minutes ago. Claire stepped closer to the operations map and studied the mountain route silently for several seconds. Then she pointed toward a narrow pass east of the canyon. He will not use the lower road. Hale frowned. Why? Too exposed after tonight. Her finger shifted toward another route crossing higher elevation ridges. He will move through the old Soviet observation paths here instead. Ethan stared at the map carefully. Those mountain trails were nearly abandoned because of unstable terrain and freezing overnight temperatures. You are certain? Claire nodded once. Commanders who survive failed ambushes stop trusting speed. They trust isolation. Colonel Hale folded his arms. You sound very familiar with his thinking. Claire's expression never changed. I am familiar with survival. The room fell quiet again. Hale looked at Ethan for a long moment before making his decision. One helicopter. Minimal team. You intercept before sunrise. Ethan nodded immediately. Understood. But before anyone moved, Hale looked directly at Claire. You are not required to go back out there tonight. Claire met his eyes without hesitation. He survived because I missed one detail in the canyon. Hale studied her carefully. That is not how the reports read. Claire looked back toward the tactical map. Reports do not matter to the people waiting in those villages. 40 minutes later, the helicopter lifted into the freezing mountain air carrying Ethan, Logan Reed, 2 additional SEAL operators, and Claire Donovan seated once again near the open side hatch with the Barrett case resting beside her boots. But this flight felt different from the first one. Nobody doubted her now. Nobody whispered about transfer orders or questioned why she had been attached to the team. The silence around Claire had changed completely. Respect had replaced uncertainty. As the helicopter crossed above the dark mountain ridges, Logan glanced toward Claire carefully. You could have stayed at the base. Claire kept her eyes on the passing terrain below. So could you. Logan almost smiled at that. Fair enough. Ethan watched her quietly from across the cabin. Earlier that day, Claire Donovan had been a stranger nobody fully trusted. Now every operator inside the helicopter understood they were flying beside someone shaped by years of impossible battlefields and impossible decisions. Not because she talked about it. Because they had seen it. The helicopter suddenly slowed as the pilot's voice crackled through comms. Movement detected ahead near the upper ridge trail. Ethan immediately leaned toward the open hatch and scanned the dark mountain path below. A lone figure moved carefully through the rocks nearly 1,200 yards ahead, heading east toward the border villages exactly where Claire predicted. Ethan looked toward her. You called it. Claire slowly reached for the Barrett case beside her seat. "No," she said quietly while opening the rifle case beneath the cold moonlight. "I remembered it." The helicopter hovered above the frozen ridge while distant mountain winds echoed through the darkness.